All right, again, as a little bit of an introduction, I am your Region 1 representative. I represent 9 states. Most of the LNC regions are 3 or 4 states, so 9 states is quite the challenge. I represent Alaska, Arizona, Colorado, Hawaii, Kansas, Montana, Utah, Washington, and Wyoming. I would say, as I said before, I really would like to keep you informed. See me after this talk or at any time so I can put you on the Region 1 mailing list. I am also the chair of the Libertarian Party Historical Committee, which I'll be talking about a little bit during this talk because it will become relevant. I'm also the communications director for the Libertarian Party of Colorado and the Colorado State Coordinator for the Libertarian Party Radical Caucus. I've recently been appointed to both the bylaws and the platform committee. So, in other words, I'm extraordinarily busy in between work. There's no time in the Libertarian Party. There's very little time for anything else. So, my talk today, let me pull out my notes here. I have become extraordinarily passionate about party history. And that has become a lot of the focus of my libertarian activism. And the way I like to start this talk, and it was most fun the first time I gave this talk when my husband was in the room, because he hears me jibber jabber all day long and he thought he heard everything. And so I started out the talk by telling everyone that I had a confession to make. And that the confession I had to make was that I was having an affair. And you should have seen his head jerk up so quickly. And it was very good. And I said, and it's a fiery, steamy, passionate affair. And then when I confessed that the affair was with the Libertarian Party and the Statement of Principles, he was like, well, I already knew that one. But it is actually true. I'm one of the people who almost offhandedly opened up the website of the Libertarian Party one day. I read the platform, particularly the Statement of Principles, and the very next website I opened up was the Colorado Secretary of State, and I switched my voter registration on the spot. I was never spoken to by any libertarian. I did not become a libertarian that way. I became a libertarian simply by reading the words that I'm going to be telling you a little bit about the history today. And it did quite literally change my life. So, I want to try to impart upon you a little bit of the passion I have and a little bit of a deeper understanding for why we have something called the Statement of Principles, what it means, and what it might mean to you today. And this is what this banner is. I actually have several of these banners at my house. It's quite interesting. I also have the framed Statement of Principles, which I found in the Colorado records and bought at an auction last Colorado convention. When I found it in the records, I almost was tempted, since nobody knew it was there, to just keep it. And then I figured stealing a copy of the Statement of Principles probably wasn't the best way to honor it, and it would have been like Poe's telltale heart on my wall beating at me. So I did win it fair and square in an auction. But this is the way the current Statement of Principles reads, and most of you have read it. But I find there's a certain power in saying the words out loud. And I would like for you to listen to me and really take them to heart. Perhaps you haven't even read them, and realize the power of these words. Libertarian Party Statement of Principles says, we, the members of the Libertarian Party, challenge the cult of the omnipotent state and defend the rights of the individual. We hold that all individuals have the right to exercise sole dominion over their own lives and have the right to live in whatever manner they choose, so long as they do not forcibly interfere with the equal right of others to live in whatever manner they choose. Governments throughout history have regularly operated on the opposite principle, that the state has the right to dispose of the lives of individuals and the fruits of their labor. Even within the United States, all political parties other than our own grant to government the right to regulate the lives of individuals and seize the fruits of their labor without their consent. We, on the contrary, deny the right of any government to do these things and hold that where governments exist, they must not violate the rights of any individual, namely, 1, the right to life. Accordingly, we support the prohibition of the initiation of physical force against others. 2, the right of liberty of speech and action. Accordingly, we oppose all attempts by government to abridge the freedom of speech and press, as well as government censorship in any form. And 3, the right to property. Accordingly, we oppose all government interference with private property. such as confiscation, nationalization, and eminent domain, and support the prohibition of robbery, trespass, fraud, and misrepresentation. Since governments, when instituted, must not violate individual rights, we oppose all interference by government in the areas of voluntary and contractual relations among individuals. People should not be forced to sacrifice their lives and property for the benefit of others. They should be left free by government to deal with one another as free traders. And the resultant economic system, the only one compatible with the protection of individual rights, is the free market.
Amen.
Amen is exactly right. Blackboard statement of principles. Those are some powerful revolutionary words right there. And if you hadn't listened to them in a while, maybe that sunk into you a little bit. I have to tell you, I'm such a policy geek that I still get chills when I say them. Now, I've been doing quite a bit of libertarian archaeology on my fascination with these particular words, and it's a work in progress. There's probably some people here today who will be able to give me some additional information that I didn't know before. I also, though, believe that this type of work is very long overdue. As I began to try to find out why we had these words and work back into time to learn about the beginnings of this party and our particular ideology, I discovered that important pieces of our history have at worst been obscured and miscast and mischaracterized, or at best they have been sorely neglected, and that we are in danger of quite literally losing a part of our history. And I'd like to dispel some of that, and I would like to be one of the people that ensure that we do not lose our history. If we do not know where we came from, we will not know where we are going. And one thing I like to say is with this last convention, Gary Johnson did such a wonderful job of bringing in new libertarians. And there's nothing I love more in the world than a newborn libertarian. But one thing we must do is educate these new libertarians. And we cannot do this if we do not know our history. And I have to tell you, some of the most exciting people that have come up to me, so excited about our history, have been these new libertarians. It's really, really great. And I'll talk a little bit more at the end about this project I'm doing to educate people on our party history beyond the talk I'm giving today. So I am now going to tell you guys some of our history. Some of it you may know, some of it you may not, but I guarantee you will learn a couple things. I hope, at least, and some of you may learn a whole lot. And I do hope you appreciate it. The very first convention of our party took place in Denver, yay, Colorado, in 1972. And at the time, it comprised a very diverse lot of people, almost like the diverse lot of people we have here today. There were minarchists, there were anarchists, there were a lot of Randians, since Ayn Rand was very popular at that time, and there were classical liberals, and there were any variation in between those. But they were all united. They were united around the idea of radical individualism. And yes, I will say the word radical, though sometimes today it seems like that might be a dirty word. But we are radical individualists. The Libertarian Party was founded as a revolutionary movement. It was a peaceful revolution, to be sure, but do not doubt for a second that our ideas are not revolutionary and that they do not remain so today. Any current perspective that you hear that does not come to grips with that early party history, with that revolutionary spirit, they're in danger of cutting off the very branch upon which we sit. And make no doubt about it, libertarianism remains a radical, revolutionary idea if we are going to be true to those words that I read to you earlier. Now, at the time of the party founding, some party founders were concerned that entrenched interests and cults of personality would come into the party, as they inevitably do into any groups, and that we would be in danger of losing our way, and we would just turn into, struggles and cliques and all the other things that you know about. And that it would turn this revolutionary idea into a footnote in history, and also ran. That was a nice idea, let's move on to the next thing. There is a man that I have the honor, he's a party founder who's still alive today, that I've had the honor to get to know very well, and his name is D. Frank Robinson from Oklahoma. And he gave me a little bit of a history of things that happened at that 1972 convention. Himself and Ed Carlson decided that they were going to convince Party Maine co-founder Nolan that they should protect this fledgling party. And the way they would protect the party was by embedding in it what they called an article of faith. It would be something that would be inserted into the soul of the party that could not be altered except by a super majority and a super quorum. And this idea was approved by the original Constitution and Bylaws Committee. As Robinson has related this to me, it's not good parliamentary form to do that. It's not good parliamentary form to put a depth charge into the heart of a group when the survival of the organization is the main thing. But they had decided that the survival of the organization wasn't the main thing. The survival of our principles was the main thing. So they concluded that it was an appropriate goal for an existentially ideological organization to fervently believe that the principles was the sine qua non of the party, not just the mere existence of some hollow shell that bore little resemblance to the ideas from which it sprung. So David Nolan and the founding delegates were convinced of the wisdom of this idea. And as Robinson described it, this was their intent, and I will quote him because I can't say it any better than he did. We wanted to plant a rhetorical stake in the ground with a tether. The statement of principles, a terse one-page document declaring to all coming after us, this is the anchor and the lifeline. Do not tread too far from it or you may perish. If you stay close, you may eventually prosper for your efforts. Now, 40 years later, we are those who came after them. And it is the same thing. This is the lifeline. If we stick close to it and continue to stick close to it, we may eventually prosper for our efforts. And I am convinced if we stray too far, we will indeed perish. Or at least what is libertarianism will indeed perish. So this is what the 1972 convention did. They passed a Declaration of Principles. They originally called it the preamble, but it is eventually what we had today. And they secured its survival by demanding, and a lot of people don't know this, that the Statement of Principles can only be amended by a 7/8 vote of registered delegates at a duly called national convention. Now, you guys had certain quorum issues here today, so I want you to let that sink in. 7/8 vote. Now, you could take what I like to call the Dumb and Dumber approach, where Jim Carrey said to her, is there a chance in a million that you might date me? And she goes, oh yeah. And he goes, well, I have a chance. No, 7/8 is not a chance. It's that 1 in a million. But I want to take this a bit further. I want you to really realize what I said. I didn't just say a 7/8 vote. I said a 7/8 vote of registered delegates at convention. If any of you have ever been to a national convention, you may realize that there isn't 7/8 of registered delegates in the room at any one time. So it is in fact functionally impossible to get that 7/8 vote. It is the parliamentary equivalent of saying it's nearly impossible, and that was by design. Also, so that is the super majority and the super quorum. So, is it possible? Yes. Is it likely? No. If 1/8 of the delegates believe still in the foundational vision of the party, the game is over. And if you cannot get 1/8 of our delegates to stand on principles, then the party was already dead, and that vote will only be the formal declaration of its passing. But these initial founders realized this was a serious step that they were taking. They were basically building a vault, stepping inside, and destroying the key. Although the Statement of Principles in 1972 passed unanimously, I want you to stop and think about this for a second. This was libertarians. There was something that passed unanimously. I'm not so sure we could pass unanimously right now that I'm standing here. But they passed the statement of principles unanimously. And it was about a group of about 80 of them. So it wasn't 2 or 3, which I just don't even think 2 or 3 libertarians can pass anything unanimously today. But they put in an escape hatch. They said that we are going to give ourselves 2 years to think about this thing that we just did. Let's come back in 1974 and revisit the issue. And in 1974, by a mere 2/3 vote, we can change the statement of principles. Or we could ditch it altogether, or we could revise it. So let's take a look now at what happened between these conventions and what happened in 1974 after that 2-year cooling off period. But before we get there, we're going to go through a little bit of geeky history here. So we're going to get to your handout at this point. In figure 1, and these are things that I've loved to dig up, you have something from the initial Constitution, Rules, and Bylaws Committee. It's Article 8, which talked about the statement of principles, and you can see about that 2/3 escape hatch and the 7/8 and all of that. In figure 2, it is the equivalent thing that is in our current bylaws. If you look at these 2 items, it's remarkable that very little has changed. It's the same thing that was in 1972 is now here in 1974, obviously omitting that 1974 escape hatch language. But there's something I'm going to read here that I will repeat multiple times, because if there's one thing you walk away from today, I want you to walk away with this. If you look in 1972, they said, the statement of principles of the platform affirms that philosophy upon which the Libertarian Party is founded, by which it shall be sustained and through which liberty shall prevail. That's what they said in 72. We say the same exact thing today. So it's remarkable, really, that this bylaw hasn't substantially changed. But I want you to sink in the fact that it said something about what the Libertarian Party believes. So I have something to tell you which is controversial today, but it's absolutely true. Anyone who says that Libertarian Party libertarianism cannot be defined, that it doesn't mean anything specific, is quite simply ignorant or ignoring our bylaws. Let me read that to you again. The statement of principles of the platform affirms that philosophy upon which the Libertarian Party is founded, by which it shall be sustained and through which liberty shall prevail. Do you want to know what Libertarian Party libertarianism is? It's this. It can be defined. It might be quite simply defined. There could be some room for interpretation in there and for a variety of views, which I will get into, but we do stand for something quite specific. We are defined by our statement of principles. That is the benchmark. There is often talk of something I believe in, but I think the word is misused. There's often talk of the big tent of libertarianism that could accommodate a wide plethora of views. And I agree with that. But this tent does in fact have boundaries. And these are the four corners of the boundaries of the big tent of libertarianism. So while anyone who is willing to go in our direction should be fully welcome as an active and valued member of our party, as long as they're willing to certify our membership pledge, the tent of essential Libertarian Party beliefs is circumscribed by our statement of principles. Any member obviously is free to disagree on some points. I disagree on some points, but the fact is that this is the ideology of the Libertarian Party. And like Trent, I need to get something to drink, but he's a good boy and drinks water. I drink caffeine. So further protections during these early years were put into place to challenge any future flanker policy that might contradict the statement of principles. And they established a judicial committee at that time. Any of you familiar with party controversies over the past 10 years know that sometimes saying the judicial committee can, have cheers or not cheers depending on one's point of view, but the initial judicial committee was established to protect the statement of principles. That was its original goal. And no matter what duties they now have, its primary duty was to be the watchdog over these particular words. And this watchdog function remains today. If you go to figures 3 and 4 in your handout, you can see the original function of the Judicial Committee, and you can see in figure 4, it remains today a primary function of the Judicial Committee, except for that resolutions have now been added. So not only can any policy or plank not contradict the statement of principles, neither can any resolution resolved at a national convention contradict the statement of principles. Also, at this time, an amendment was made that made affirmation of the statement of principles an absolute condition of affiliation with the national party, and that is in figure 5. As you know, state party affiliates are autonomous, but they're autonomous within several limitations, very narrow ones. One, you must file a copy of your bylaws with the national party. Easy enough, right? But also, every single state affiliate must affirm the statement of principles. If a state affiliate disaffirms the statement of principles, arguably in our bylaws, they have disavowed their affiliation with the national party. The statement of principles is not optional. Being an affiliate of the national party means that you have affirmed the statement of principles. And I cannot repeat that enough. This is, in fact, the lifeblood of our party. So, going back to 1972, the initial platform committee, which was chaired by Pip Boyle, set to work writing a statement of principles. The initial result was deemed to be unsatisfactory. It was deemed to be something that was quite obviously written by committee. If any of you have been on committees, you know sometimes things that are written by committees are not the most elegant things that can ever be done. So they thought that the content was good, but the style was wanting. So they determined at that time that they would take submissions from the floor, and legend has it, people went off and wrote things for about an hour and came and presented them to the convention. During debate on the order of adoption, meaning whether the convention would adopt a statement of principles first or a platform first, several insightful comments were made at that 1972 convention. And if you're wondering how I know this, I have the tapes of the 1972 convention that were found in D. Frank Robinson's basement, and I've listened to it, and it is really, really quite interesting what was going on. The conventions were just as lively then as they are now. But several insightful comments were made arguing that we could not adopt planks until we had principles from which those planks would be derived. And Toni Nathan was at that original convention, and she just had, every time I heard her, she had the greatest, wonderful voice. And Toni Nathan got up on the convention floor and she exclaimed, "We will be the laughing stock of the world if we adopt planks without first adopting our principles," full of fire and vigor. And it was just wonderful. So the delegates said, yes, we will adopt our statement of principles before we write a platform. And there were 5 proposals submitted. And what I did with these 1972 tapes is I sat down and I transcribed these proposals that were submitted. I think this might have been the first time that was done in over 40 years. And they are contained in your handout as figures 6 through 10, which on your own time you may want to read through the things which possibly could have been our statement of principles. And if any of you have read Ayn Rand, you will see the very strong Randian strands through here. Some of these I'm actually very glad we did not adopt, because there was all that, man is not a sacrificial animal. If any of you know Ayn Rand, she loved that phrase. So some, excuse me, some of these statement of principles are quite interesting. But it was the proposal of John Hosper's, which was the version that was adopted. And something I've dug out of history, if you go to figure 12, that's actual copy of his handwritten and typed notes from the 1972 convention. It's a piece of history there. That is what was submitted to the 1972 convention with his little handwritten notes as they were changing things. on the floor. And I have to tell you, if any of you are familiar with John Hospers, you know he had a wonderful voice. He had a wonderful speaking voice. And in listening to those tapes that were in someone's basement for decades, and I was listening to them on my computer, to hear John Hospers, as they announced him coming up and say those words for the very first time that they were heard, we, the members of the Libertarian Party, challenge the cult of the omnipotent state and defend the rights of the individual. In John Hosper's voice, it nearly brought me to tears. I mean, it was just so wonderful. So after the Hospers proposal was passed, the delegates then gave the 2 years to consider. So at the next convention in 1974, when they came together, they could soften what John Hospers wrote. They could scrap it all together and write a new statement of principles. But what in fact did happen in 1974, and this is the crux of what I'm here to talk about today. What they did in 1974 is they did in fact amend the statement of principles, and it has never been amended since because there is that 7/8 rule. How did they amend it? They in fact amended it by making it even more radical than the original version proposed by John Hospers. Because what happened between 1972 and 1974, and I want you all to prepare to be very scandalized and very shocked, because you will not believe that this happened. But during those 2 years of between 72 and 74, disagreements started to form within the Libertarian Party. It's unbelievable. Nobody believes me when it says that there were factions, there were schisms, people were threatening to walk out. I know, unbelievable, because this never happens today. And what was in fact happening is that there was a majority minarchist part of the party, and the Randians tended to be with those, and there was a minority anarchist faction of the party. And it was threatening to split the party, with the anarchist faction threatening to walk out. Would this have been fatal in 1974? We don't know. I tend to think it would have been, but that's arguable. And they both sides were arguing from fundamental libertarian principles. But rather than split the party, what they decided to do was reach an agreement at the 1974 convention, which was held in Dallas. And their agreement was that while the party would be working towards a society free from the initiation of force and coercion, that the party itself would take no ultimate endgame position on whether or not the state must exist in the end. And that settling the debate on whether or not the state should exist would be reserved, would be postponed as any official party decision until at least minarchy was achieved. At that point, the debate would become relevant, and it was not to be relevant up until that point. Now, a lot of legends have arisen about this agreement. And I want to get a few things up front here. It's an agreement that we'll be talking about called the Dallas Accord. But like most events in history, the participants at the time did not realize they were making history. For instance, I doubt that General Custer knew at the time he was participating in that skirmish that it would be called Custer's Last Stand. That was something it ended up being called many years later. The delegates in Dallas did not realize that they were sitting down and it wasn't like a treaty with two sides and a mediator between them. We are creating the Dallas Accord. It became known as the Dallas Accord years later. History tends to be a bit messier than that, but that is in fact the event that we are now referring to as the Dallas Accord. There are some things that, there's been a lot of mythology. I have to tell you, if you've ever read the Wikipedia article on it, it's terrible. Even I wrote part of it. Part I wrote's not terrible, just saying. But in general, there's a lot of mythology that has arisen about the Dallas Accord. What exactly was it? Was it simply a handshake agreement amongst the 1974 delegates that doesn't mean anything to us today? Was it more than that? What exactly was it? I would say yes and yes. There was some of it that was informal. Like some people claim that the Dallas Accord meant that the platform could never say things that might indicate anything about the state. Some people say that if the platform ever said anything like that, that meant that the Dallas Accord was broken. So I'm going to dispel some of this false history about the Dallas Accord. And I'm astonished, actually I'm literally scandalized, and this isn't one of my typical exaggerations, I'm literally scandalized that there hasn't been significantly more pushback about this area of our history. And my passion for untangling it is why I'm standing here before you. So we like talking about, alternative facts? Is that what Kelly Conway called them? Alternative facts. Here's an alternative fact that's often cited. This alternative fact is that the Dallas Accord was entirely informal. The whole thing was informal and is only used today as an interesting historical oddity that it's not binding upon anyone in this room. This is easily disproven, though. It's easily disproven through witness testimony, such as the people I've interviewed who were actually there. But you want to know what? I found that witness testimony varies. After 40 years, people remember things differently. And we actually don't even have a copy. Can you believe as a party, and I'm hoping to find it, there isn't a copy of these 1974 minutes. And I do have a copy of the audio tape from 1974, and it heartbreakingly is missing the one tape that had the discussion surrounding the edits to the Statement of Principles. Yeah. That did break my heart. And I do hope to find minutes of this 1974 convention. But it's easily disproven. I'm a paralegal by trade. I've been a paralegal for 20 years. So it's easily disproven through forensic document examination. And I'll explain to you exactly what I mean. Let me just skip ahead here because I started going a little bit off script. So I am claiming that at least portion of the Dallas Accord was formalized and that it's binding upon each of us. But do I have any evidence for this extraordinary claim? Because it is an extraordinary claim. It's not the received history that if any of you had even heard of the Dallas Accord today, you probably have never heard this statement. But I do in fact have evidence that there was at least part of it that is binding and that was formalized. We have an artifact from that time that rings through history. I think it rings like a bell and it cuts through the fog of these decades. And you want to know what that evidence is? It is the amendments to the Statement of Principles that took place in 1974. All this groundwork I did to you about the 7/8 and the supermajority and the superquorum and all that was to show you how seriously the Statement of Principles was taken. And the fact that it hasn't been amended since 1974 shows you how serious it was. So if you go to page 10 on your handouts, you will see in figure 13, the 1972 Statement of Principles, which is different from the Statement of Principles that's here before you. And then immediately following it, you will see the 1974 Statement of Principles. But the most interesting thing, and I don't know if anyone else has ever done this exercise, on page 12, I took the liberty of comparing the two and color coding for you the differences, the edits that were done in 1974. And these changes can be grouped into 4 categories. There were style and grammatical changes. There were gender neutrality changes. Man and mankind was changed to people or things. We were very forward-thinking back then. Now, nobody thought anything of saying he or men then, but the Libertarian Party back then was sensitive to that and made it gender neutral. And then there were changes I call the Dallas Accord changes. And those are the changes in yellow. And that is what I would really like you to pay attention to right now. What you are looking at in all those things in yellow is the Dallas Accord. The thing that people keep telling you was never formalized and was just a handshake agreement. The fact is, it is contained within the Statement of Principles. The Statement of Principles, which requires 7/8 of registered delegates if any of you wanted to amend it next convention. There could be nothing more serious than that. When I began this analysis and did this color coding, which again, I don't think has ever been done before, it might have been, who knows, everyone always thinks they're so wonderful and then it turns out they're not, but I was already aware that the Dallas Accord changes made the existence of the state optional. Most people knew that, I knew that. And I knew that it gave a couple quote-unquote nods to anarchy. But until I did this analysis, I didn't realize how deep the changes went. So let's take a look at it. The 1972 version of the Statement of Principles said, "The sole function of government is the protection of the rights of each individual." And it also said, "Government has only one legitimate function, the protection of individual rights." Neither of those phrases appear in the current Statement of Principles. What they did is they changed those phrases in 1974 to say, where governments exist, they must not violate the rights of any individual. And governments, when instituted, must not violate individual rights. At first glance, you might not, the first thing you'll notice is those maybe odd phrases, where governments exist and governments when instituted. Those are the two things most people know right away that give some nods to anarchy or the potential of it. But that actually isn't the most important changes. The most important change, besides, the existence of government being made optional, it is that the 1972 Statement of Principles assigned a positive to the government. What I mean by a positive role is that originally the Statement of Principles said that the government had to do something. The government had to protect rights. That was its role. The 1974 Statement of Principles has turned that completely on its head. There is no positive role of government in this document. It assigns government a negative role. The government must not do something. The government must not violate rights. That is a monumental change. And that actually has deep implication for the battles we keep waging today. I know, they're really, and you guys never have any battles, it's only the other states. I know it doesn't happen in Washington. But this has deep implications for the factional battles today. So if someone is on the minarchist side of the debate, you cannot simply point to rights protection and say that is what the state should do or what the state does. All ideological issues about the state, at least according to our Statement of Principles, must center around proving that the state does not violate rights. That is all we say in our foundational document about the state. It must not violate rights. And that is the heart of the dispute, the heart of the little no-state dispute. And you want to know something? The party itself said, we don't take a stand on it. The party itself is agnostic on that. That doesn't mean you have to be. I'm not. I'm an open anarchist. I have been for a long time. But the party itself does not take a definitive stand on that. It's a legitimate disagreement. But my opinion, and I would hope this would be your opinion, is that this disagreement is so far off, and our actual differences are so trivial, and that when it comes to the goal of all human interactions being voluntary and peaceful, this is where I think Harry Browne had it right. And this isn't just, I think he had it right with all of our disputes, not just with minarchists or anarchists, but with classical liberals or anyone else who wants more liberty than we have today. And what Harry Browne had said, which I'm sure you all have heard, is that we're all on a train heading in one direction. And some of us will get off that train sooner than others, and some of us will take it all the way to the end. And I believe that is actually an excellent model for party unity. And that's what I try to call everyone to. I don't argue with people or disfellowship or whatever you want to call it, people who disagree with my particular view. Though I can tell you, and I think this should be our shame, I'm the subject of an excommunication attempt about once a week probably for my views. And it should not be that way for any of us. I would say though that this Harry Browne analogy of the train heading in the same direction and how we can all just pull together, this is being disturbingly denied by people in the party today. What they're saying is that setting up a very limited non-rights violating state is incompatible and functionally different than a no-state option. So that they say, no, we're not really trains heading in the same direction. One's heading to New York and one is heading to California. If you start dividing between the minarchist and anarchist debate that way, then are we going to start saying then between the minarchists and the classical liberals that one's going to New York and one's going to Colorado? How far are we going to parse this out? Our differences are really so trivial. we can all pull together going in the same direction. And then when it gets relevant, maybe then some of us will have to part ways. But we are so far from that right now with the way the state is growing and encroaching upon our rights. I would say that everyone heading in our direction is welcome, but we must not forget our destination, which is, as our preamble says, and I gotta look at the time here if anyone can let me know. Looks like I'm still going good. Okay, we must not forget our destination. And the destination is, as our platform says, a world set free in our lifetimes. Now, a lot of people say, that's interesting. Okay, so now I understand that if I'm going to start throwing one person or another out of the party, you really are in violation of the statement of principles. But there is a practical implication to all of this. This isn't just esoteric, navel-gazing, interesting bits of history. So what does that mean for us today? Well, what I'm going to say next might be controversial, but I hope I've shown you that I know how to analyze documents and I can make a persuasive argument for my case even if you end up disagreeing with me. The platform, what having a implanted statement of principles does is it frees the platform to be transitional. If we have an end game statement in our statement of principles, we can then propose interim steps in our platform. And this is the way it was intended to be in 1972. So the platform can take softer stands as long as it never contradicts the ultimate end game of the statement of principles. The present preamble that we have in our platform makes that clear. Some people don't realize that we say this actually in our platform. The introduction to our platform says these specific policies are not our goal. Our goal is nothing less than a world set free in our lifetimes. So I'm going to give you a real-life example of why this is important. At the 2016 Libertarian Party convention, there was a resolution passed. The resolution was that taxation is theft. I will read to you this resolution from the convention minutes. Jim Fulner of Michigan moved that we adopt the following resolution. Be it resolved to taxation is theft. Following debate, the resolution was adopted by a voice vote. I don't know, I just love those little things there. It's following debate. I was there, it was really quite interesting. There really wasn't much debate. It was adopted overwhelmingly by a voice vote. Now, resolutions are not, in fact, the platform, but they are a different kind of official statement of an organization. And the fact is, right now, despite what some people might say, the official position of the Libertarian Party, resolved at convention, is that taxation is theft. The bylaws required thresholds and review are exactly the same. 2/3 must conform to the statement of principles and is subject to review of the Judicial Committee. That resolution was never challenged. Now, there are some that have argued with me on this, that our current platform does not take the position that taxation is theft and that this 2016 resolution was some kind of radical takeover of the party, some statement that contradicts our platform. Well, I can tell you one thing, as a member of the Radical Caucus, I would have been thrilled if we had this radical takeover or whatever at convention, but that isn't in fact what happened. This was your typical convention goer that resolved this. But I want to challenge the statement that our current platform does not already say that taxation is theft. And I'm going to prove this in the same way I dealt with the statement of principles. We're going to do it through a forensic document examination and do a historical autopsy. In figure 16 of your handout, there's my case study on taxation as theft. In figure 16, you will see the 1972 plank on the economy. And that plank mentions taxation, but the plank only mentions the reduction of taxes. So since that plank only mentioned the reduction of taxes, would that mean that in 1972 they did not believe that taxation was theft, only that excessive taxation was theft? No, actually, later on in the platform in figure 17, they had something called long-range goals. I actually think that might be a good idea for us today. But they had something called long-range goals in 1972. And I want you to notice something immediately interesting there. That part of the platform recognized that there was a need to deal immediately with what presently existed, the state and taxation. And it still recognized that there were longer-term goals. And what did they state in 1972 was their long-range goal? The eventual repeal of all, not some, of all taxation. And they gave the reason why they believed in the eventual repeal of all taxation. They said, since we believe that every man is entitled to keep the fruits of his labor. Now, after all my preaching on the Statement of Principles, that phrase should be intimately familiar to you. Where does it come from? It comes from the Statement of Principles. We say in the Statement of Principles, we believe that every man is entitled to keep the fruit of his labor. That statement has always been part of our platform. So we have, a lot of us here are constitutionalists who believe that original intent matters. So the original intent of the people who wrote the Statement of Principles and the statement that says, we believe that every man is entitled to keep the fruits of her labor, they explained in the 1972 platform exactly what that entailed. That entailed the eventual repeal of all taxation. And the reason is that any forcible collection of something that belongs to you is in violation of your individual rights. So this did not apply solely to income tax, which is the argument that is often given today. That flank made clear that it referred to all taxation, and then it went on to describe a voluntarily funded government. In 1974, and Figure 8, this idea of the repeal of all taxation was moved up, and then if you look in Figure 19, there was another interesting statement made which is relevant to debates today, and I bolded it for you. They were talking about religious freedom and the taxation of churches. And in 1974, they said, actually 1976, they said, we oppose taxation of church property for the reason that we oppose all taxation. They opposed all taxation in 1976. And then, if you look at Figure 20, they also then started singling out income taxation. But this singling out of income taxation was never intended to be separate or apart from the position of the Statement of Principles that requires the eventual repeal of all taxation. So now that you have this history of how we started to single out income taxation and what the Statement of Principles' original intent was, we can come to our current platform, which is in Figure 21, which says all persons are entitled to keep the fruits of their labor. We call for the repeal of the income tax, the abolishment of the Internal Revenue Service, and all federal programs and services not required under the U.S. Constitution. Do you notice again, it still says why? Because all persons are entitled to keep the fruits of their labor. That's a statement from the Statement of Principles, which we know from an unbroken line of communication from 1972 means all forcible, not just your income tax. Any kind of taxation is in violation of the Statement of Principles. So the fact that we single out the income tax today does not mean that we no longer support the eventual repeal of all taxation. This is simply a good target. It's a transitory target on our immediate horizon. It's something that we can accomplish today. And this is in accordance with the thoughts of our early founders that the income tax was the worst of all taxations. David Nolan stated, in an ideal world, there would be no taxation. All services would be paid for on an as-used basis. But in a less than ideal world, some services will be force-financed for the foreseeable future. But not all taxes are equally deleterious. The worst tax of all is the income tax. That is why we single it out. So with all of this history and background, and you see how we got the statements you are, this actually has practical use today. It helps you interpret our platform. So in this sense, I hope I gave you some practical implication of why this matters. It matters for factional disputes. It matters for party peace and unity, which is one of the most important things that I believe in, is party peace and unity. And it also helps you interpret the platform today. And I find this is something that we really need to inculcate in these wonderful brand new born libertarians that are coming into our party, who may read a statement such as the repeal of income tax and think that's all we're opposed to. It is not, in fact, all we're opposed to. So I'm going to close this one moment and then give you what I promised at the beginning. So, I hope you found it helpful, like I said. We're moving towards a world set free in our lifetime in which all human interactions will be free of force and fraud. Some of us see that as a completely voluntary society, including competitive services for all services of government, such as police and military. Others of you would stop shy of there. But the original vision of the formative years of this party has held true for 4 decades, in that we're all headed in the same direction. And in order for us to succeed and thrive, we must recognize this. And I believe it is beautifully encapsulated in our lovely statement of principles. And this is why our bylaws declare that this is the philosophy upon which the Libertarian Party is founded, by which it will be sustained, and through which liberty shall prevail. And that's it for the main discussion. So I do hope you found that informative. Do I have time for any questions on this? And one thing I want to give some information on, the historical committee that I mentioned at the beginning of their talk. I was in Alexandria in December, and I asked to see their archives because I have this fetish for party history. And when I went and saw all of these wonderful records, and there's a storeroom full of it. There was a legend that all of our records were destroyed in the flood at the Watergate building. That's not in fact true. There is so much party history just sitting in a storage facility. So I came back and ranted and raved about it, and sometimes I swear the LNC did this to me because they thought, well, there has been over 3,000 emails on the email list on the LNC in this term, and 1,200 of them are mine. And there's 17 members on the committee, so that tells you how active I am in jibber-jabbering. So I sometimes think they put me in charge of the party historical committee because they thought they would bury me in records and maybe I'd be less active on the LNC list. That hasn't succeeded so far. So now all of the records are getting shipped to Colorado next weekend. So the storage facility of all of those records, I have volunteered to put my professional paralegal to use to categorize and start organizing these records with the goal of getting them digitized and online. Probably all of them will never be, but at least a good portion may be. And I'm starting with the things I think will be of most interest to most people. While I might be personally interested in a piece of tissue that David Nolan used to blow his nose with, that's probably not what everyone is interested in. So right now, there is a project called LPWA. LPWA has been around for a while, but it basically died. We have revived it. If you go to LPWA now, it's a collaborative history of the Libertarian Party. Right now, we have decades of something called the Liberty Pledge. Some of you who are regular contributors to the party know you get that. Well, that's been going out for decades. I have the historical copies of them back 20, 30 years up on LPWA right now. My next goal, excuse me, my next goal is to get all of the old copies of LP News up on LPWA. When I was in Alexandria, I held the original copy of the 1972 LP News. And it was wonderful. And I would like everyone to have, at least digitally, that wonderful experience. But also in these archives, there are training brochures. Why should the state affiliates have to keep recreating the wheel? There are position papers. The party has been writing about, say, gun rights for 40 years. When your candidates go out and they need to make statements, why should you have to rewrite all this? If we had all of this up on LPWA, you could take a paragraph here, a paragraph here. So it's not just arcane historical knowledge, which I love for its own sake. It's practical knowledge that will help affiliates and will preserve our history. I have to tell you, to my horror, in one of these discussions, it actually did come out, why don't we just throw all this stuff out? Oh my God, no. So I'm going to do what I can to preserve our history. And another thing I also believe in, and again, you can see me after this, there's been a certain budget allotted for this by the LNC, but I believe if people believe in projects, they should crowdfund it. I would like for the budget for this historical preservation not to come out of the regular LNC or Libertarian Party budget. So we are trying to crowdsource it. If I inculcated any passion in you for party history, I ask that you give to this fund so that we can prove to the party that our history is worth preserving and that people do in fact care about it. And I'm not the only Looney Tune in the party that cares about this sort of thing. So with that now, on any possible thing, well, almost any, yeah, I guess it's kind of like an AMA, but maybe on what we talked about here, if anyone had any questions to ask me.
So not so much of a question, but more of a statement. I think you're not stressing the fact that at the convention for the taxation of theft, it went through like that in like no time. It was
Yes.
like maybe 3 minutes tops.
When it says following debate, it was adopted by voice vote. That, yeah, no, it was adopted by shouts and hoots and hollers and stamping. I think the only thing that got more attention was when the death penalty planked that convention. I actually cried when that passed. But yes, you're correct. It was completely non-controversial, and it wasn't a room full of hair-on-fire radicals that passed it. It was your average, everyday libertarians that passed that. Yes?
Yeah, and I've heard the terms anarchy and menarchy and classical liberty. Can you explain what those mean a little bit?
Sure, and these will be very basic
Yeah.
definitions. I'm sure that's, some political science person could correct me here to Kingdom Come. But in general, at least as the Libertarian Party has believed that, a minarchist would be someone that believes that the government's only legitimate function would be things such as military and police and rights protection and courts, so that there would be a territorial monopoly on rights protection. A libertarian anarchist believes that even those services should be up for the free market. So it's not that they don't believe that we should have them, they just don't believe there should be a monopoly on them. So if I were standing here with an actual minarchist, the only difference between us would be, should there be competition in these services? And when you word it that way, that distinction is so trivial. It is so trivial that I refuse to argue about it. Now, classical liberals believe that government should do a bit more. Classical liberals will tend to think public schooling should be something, something funded by the government. They also believe in roads. Woo! Yeah, they also really want the government to do roads. So it's just different spectrums, but they're all small government philosophies, all three of them. Was that sufficient?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, so we're good? All right, thank you so much.